This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Hey everyone, and welcome back for another very exciting Blender tutorial. Now in this tutorial...
Man on a dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and the bottle of rum.
In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create 3D animations in Blender. Now, this is part 5 of my absolute beginner tutorial series for how to use Blender, and I will assume that you have watched all 4 previous parts before trying to jump into this one. If you haven't yet, I'm going to drop you the link to the entire series down in the video description so you can go and check that out before you come back here. In this tutorial, you will learn how to create and modify keyframes in Blender to create animations, how to use interpolation mode to tweak the timing of those animations, how to use parenting to link objects together so you can animate them as a group, and how to modify the origin of your objects to change the point around which your objects animate. Now, this is going to be an intermediate level tutorial, and if that throws you off, this video is animations for absolute beginners, not Blender as a whole for absolute beginners. Also, as you may know, Blender is actually already up to version 3.0, but for now I'm going to continue using version 2.9 simply because I found version 3.0 rather buggy and it crashed a lot. However, anything I show you in this tutorial, you'll be able to follow along with Blender 3.0 or a later version. You shouldn't have any issues at all. And if you do get stuck, just drop me a comment down below and I'll help you out. But first off, I want to give a big shout out to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video and helping me pay the bills. Envato Elements is a massive online resource offering over 55 million digital assets to kickstart your next creative project. They've got everything from graphic and video templates for your favorite tools such as Premiere Pro, After Effects, DaVinci Resolve and others, to stock footage, graphic elements, music tracks, sound effects, fonts, website templates and a ton more. They offer a really simple licensing model that gives you full commercial rights to any asset you download, and this license remains valid even after your subscription has ended. You can sign up for a monthly or an annual subscription, both giving you unlimited downloads across all of the assets, and I will drop you a special link down in the video description that will give you 50% off when you choose the annual plan. And if you're unsure, why not sign up for a free account? You get 12 free assets every month and you can upgrade your account at any time you want. But now I feel like I've waffled on forever, let's finally jump into the tutorial. Welcome back to Blender. This is where we ended up in the last part of this tutorial series. We created our little pirate treasure chest. We applied some basic materials and textures to it. And if you do want to follow along with this tutorial, you will be able to download this very file from our website. So simply go to surfacedstudio.com/downloads and you'll be able to grab this file so you can follow along right from here. If you now press 0 on your numpad to go into camera view, now this looks pretty good, but it is just a static image. Even if you were to render this scene into a video file, it would just be this one image for the duration of your video. So let's make this a little bit more exciting and start adding some animations. In order to manage animations in Blender, you will need to work with the timeline panel. In the default Blender layout, you will find the timeline panel just underneath the 3D view. Down here at the bottom, it's kind of squished together. So let's click on this horizontal bar at the top of the timeline panel, drag that up to make it a little bit bigger. And by the way, if you can't find this panel, you can convert any panel in Blender, just like I showed you in the very beginner tutorial. Just click onto the icon in the top left-hand side of any panel and make sure you change that over to the timeline view. Now, this is your Blender timeline. It's essentially the frames 1 to 250 laid out left to right. The little timeline indicator shows you which frame you're looking at. So right now I'm looking at frame 1. You can simply left click on that and drag that to the right to scrub through your animation, and you may notice that nothing changes because, well, we haven't added any animation just yet. You can also press space to start playing back your animation and space again to stop. There's also playback controls here if you prefer, so you can just start playback. You can rewind. By the way, the shortcut key for rewind is Shift and left arrow or Shift and right arrow to jump to the end of your animation. Makes it just nice and easy to navigate around. With the mouse cursor over the timeline, if you scroll your wheel down, you're going to zoom out. Scrolling up will zoom in. And you can click and hold your middle mouse button to drag the timeline left and right. And if you don't have a middle mouse button or you just don't like using it, you also have this little scroll bar down here at the bottom that you can shrink in and navigate around with however you want to. Let me just zoom out a little bit so we can see our entire timeline from 1 to 250 frames. By the way, you can adjust the start and end frame of your animation up here. Simply just type in, well, I want to go maybe 1 to only 150 frames. So now my animation, if I exported this project, would simply go 150 frames long. So you can control the length of your video this way. Now, if you play back your animation, again, press space on the keyboard. Nothing happens because we haven't added any animation to any object in our scene just yet. So let's rewind our timeline, shift left arrow. Let's select the light in our scene. If you press G and drag, you can move this light around. If you press X, you're going to confine the movement to the X-axis, and let's animate this light to kind of move from down here on the left side of the treasure chest all the way over to the right. So with the light on the left-hand side of the treasure chest, let's place it right there. We now need to create a keyframe. A keyframe records the current properties, the position, the scale, the rotation, and anything else of an object at that point in time. So right now we're on frame 1, and we want to record the position of the light at that point in time. In order to do that, go over to the right-hand side into the Properties panel and select this little orange square here, which is the Object Properties. This shows you that right now we have a point light selected, and that has a transform on it, which is a location, rotation, and a scale. This changes as you move the light around. So if I move this light, you can see how the values over here on the right-hand side update, because they're just the coordinates and the values for those properties of the light. Now I want to create a keyframe, and you can do that simply by right-clicking on any property or any property group in your Properties panel. So right-click and select to insert keyframe. The shortcut key for that is I. You also have the option to insert a single keyframe, and we can ignore that for now, but what it essentially means is that your location is an X, Y, and Z value. If you insert a single keyframe, you may only add a keyframe to the Y position, but not the X and Z position. We'll get to that a little bit later. Let's simply right-click on that, click on Insert Keyframes, and you can see that all of these values have now turned orange. The other thing you will notice is that on your timeline, you now also have this little yellow diamond. This represents a keyframe on your timeline. You may have noticed that as I moved this timeline indicator away from that keyframe over on the right-hand side, the values turned green. It just indicates that there is a keyframe on this property, but you're not right now on a keyframe. If you move this timeline indicator back to frame 1 where we placed that keyframe, you can see the color goes yellow, just indicating that you are currently over a keyframe. You can also see that here with this little diamond that's indicated over on the right-hand side. So if you now scrub forward to maybe frame 100 or so, let's again make sure you have the light selected, press G and X again to lock that movement, and let's move the light over to the right-hand side of the treasure chest. You can now in the Properties panel see that the location X, which is the value we changed, is now indicated as orange, saying we've changed this value, but we haven't yet created a keyframe. What that means is that this value is not yet locked in. So if I now change my timeline indicator, let's just grab it and drag it back. Can you see my light just kind of snap back? It's because, well, we didn't record it, so Blender reverted to using the value that we actually keyframed. So again, let's go to frame 100, G and X, and let's move the light over to the right-hand side. And now let's lock this value in. And for that, again, just right-click and select to insert keyframe. I'm not going to do that because I'm a big fan of shortcut keys. So simply hover your mouse over the properties you want to insert a keyframe for. Press I to insert the keyframe. You can also click the little diamond icon over on the right-hand side. It does the same thing. And now we have another keyframe in our timeline. And now if you scrub in your timeline, you can see the light move from its initial keyframe, its initial position, to its final position. Blender automatically interpolates, it blends the value from the start to the end to give you a smooth animation. And if you now rewind this animation, press space to play it back, you can see the light animate and swing across from the left to the right. Now, down in the timeline right now, you can see 2 yellow diamonds representing the 2 keyframes we added on the light. The timeline will only show you the keyframes for the objects you actually have selected. So if I unselect the light, the keyframes are going to vanish because, well, on the scene, or if I select the treasure chest, there are no keyframes on these objects. It's only when I select the light that I can actually see the keyframes because that's the object that I've added keyframes to. In the timeline panel over on the left-hand side, I don't know whether you can see it here, there's a tiny, tiny arrow pointing to the right. If you click on that, you're going to expand a little window that can show you which objects in your scene actually are keyframed. So right now you can see summary here. If you click on this little twirly on the left-hand side, you're going to expand that. Point action, ignore that for now. Object transform, if you expand that, you can see the keyframes are sitting on the X, Y, and Z property of the object. So this can sometimes be very useful to show you exactly which properties are animated on an object, because you may animate lots of different properties on the same object. So At the top level, all you're going to see is 2 keyframes, but you may want to dig into that to see, well, it's the X position, and you can change the keyframes and the values in the interpolation modes, stuff we get to a little bit later in this tutorial individually, so this can be super useful. Let me collapse that back up to the summary level, and if you don't want to see this panel anymore, you can just click on the right-hand side of it and just drag it over to the left, and it'll collapse right back down again. Now, our light animates from frame 1 to frame 100 over to the right-hand side. The keyframes are orange right now because they're actually selected. If you click anywhere in the timeline, you can see them go gray. They're now unselected. And you can actually just left-click on any of them and just drag them around to change the timing. So let's just drag these in a little bit. For example, to have the light move from frame 30 to frame 90. And you can tweak this in any way you want. You can add more keyframes to it to, move your light around in any crazy way. I'm just going to reset my keyframes to go from frame 1 to frame 100. And I'm going to come to frame 50. I'm going to grab the light. Let's press Z to move it up a little bit. So I'm going to move the light up just a little bit because I want it animating from the bottom left, swinging up, and then back down on the right-hand side. Again, if I now moved my timeline indicator, my light would return back to its normal position because I haven't keyframed that property. So G and Z again with the light selected. Let's drag it up. Come over to the right-hand side and either right-click, insert keyframe, press I, or just press that little diamond over on the right-hand side here. And you may have noticed that this only added a keyframe to the Z property. Let's also add them to the X and Y just to keep it consistent. You don't need to. You can animate anything in Blender in any way you want. But now we've added a new keyframe at frame 50. So the light now moves up and then back down. Let's rewind, play this animation, and just have a look at the path and the movement of the light. Cool, that looks pretty good. Now, another way to create keyframes more automatically so you don't have to manually insert them all the time is to enable automatic keying. In Blender, on the timeline panel, there's a little record button here. If you click this, you're going to enable auto keying. That means that the moment you change a property, it will automatically record a keyframe against that. So if I now grab the light at maybe frame 80, let's just grab it and move it over to the right-hand side here, left click to place it, you can see that, whoa, on the right-hand side, all of these properties have now been keyframed automatically, and there's a keyframe on my timeline because Blender automatically created keyframes, so now you've got another keyframe in your animation. But it does look a little bit weird, so let's select just that one keyframe at frame 80, press X to delete it. Yep, delete keyframes, and now we're back to our 3 keyframe animation. Now we still have auto keying enabled, and by the way, in Blender there's actually a way to control exactly which properties of the objects are automatically keyframed by Blender. And if you pop open this little drop down here for keying, you can create things called keying sets, which are groups of properties that Blender will then automatically key, but it's probably a topic for another tutorial. So let's not do anything with that. Let's disable auto keying. Make sure you're at the beginning of your animation, press space to play it back, and just have a look at the path of the light. That looks pretty nice. And you may notice that the light doesn't actually move consistently. It actually starts slow, gets a little bit faster, and then it slows back down at the end. And that has to do with interpolation modes. Interpolation modes essentially tell Blender how to blend between different values. Because we only have 3 keyframes, Blender has to decide, how do I slowly transition from this keyframe over to the values in this keyframe and over to the values in this keyframe. And right now Blender is using something called Bezier interpolation, which is a fancy way of saying it's kind of like every point has a curve handle, and so it gives you smooth curves, so it's kind of more naturally ramps up and then slows down. However, you can change all of these interpolation modes. Let's click, drag, and box select all 3 keyframes in our timeline, right-click any one of them, and in here you have a whole bunch of different options for keyframe type, handle types, easing modes, all sorts of stuff. The one I want to look at is interpolation mode. So right now it's set to Bezier, which is the default. However, you can also set it to linear, which means that Blender won't ease in and out. So it won't speed up or slow down. It just consistently changes, blends between those values. So if you now come back and play this animation back, and again, just have a look at the movement of the light. Can you see how much more robotic that feels? Because it is really just very linear. It doesn't try to do anything organic or natural. It just goes blend very straight up until I hit this keyframe, and then from that value, transition over into that keyframe value, and everything is very straight. And this is great for more robotic animations. The cool thing is you can pick and choose between different keyframes. So let's select only the first keyframe Right-click that, select Interpolation mode, and choose Bezier. Now, only the first keyframe will actually do this whole speed up and slow down. The other two keyframes, these two here, will still use linear interpolation. So if you now rewind and play this back, and again, keep an eye on the light, it speeds up. And then from the second keyframe to the third, it's fully straight and robotic again. Let's click in our timeline to unselect everything, click in box select the last two keyframes, right-click, Interpolation mode. Let's try something completely different. Again, play around with this. There's lots of different options. Let's select bounce. Let's rewind our animation and play this back. That's kind of cool. We kind of have like a dropping down and bouncing animation created in Blender without really adding any additional keyframes. Blender does that automatically just by us choosing the appropriate interpolation mode. Now again, in Blender, you can get much more fine-grained control over all of this stuff if you use something called the graph editor, which shows you the animation and the path that values take and gives you all sorts of advanced features. Again, probably something for a future tutorial. If you're interested, drop me a comment down below. For now, what I'm going to do is in the timeline panel, click anywhere to unselect everything. With the cursor still over the timeline, press A to select everything. And usually most shortcuts actually work across all of the different panels, but they're then relative to the context. So A within the timeline selects all keyframes. In the 3D view, it would select all objects, etc., etc. So with all keyframes selected, right-click, interpolation mode, select Bezier. So we're resetting our light to kind of just have this nice, smooth, more organic animation. With the cursor over the 3D view, press 0 on your numpad to return to camera view. Rewind again, and let's just play this back. And that's what our animation would now look like if we rendered this out into a video file. But let's just keep going and make this more fancy. Let's rewind our animation again, and let's have the camera kind of swing from the left to the right-hand side, just as the light moves. For that, go into camera view by pressing 0 on your numpad. And if you now move the camera, you're going to break out of that camera view. So again, back to camera view. With the cursor over the 3D view, press N to bring up the properties panel on the right-hand side. Go into view and enable lock camera to view. So now as we move the camera, we're not going to break out of it. We're actually going to change the position of the camera. In the outliner over on the right-hand side, expand the scene collection and make sure you have the camera selected so that the properties here actually represent the camera. If you still have the light selected, the properties are for the light. So make sure you're on the camera. And now with our timeline indicator at frame 1, again, shift and left arrow. If you want to rewind, let's rotate the camera a little bit. And you can see because we're locked to that view, our camera remains in that view. So let's say we want to start here. In the object properties, again, I have no keyframes. So I'm going to slide my cursor over the location, press I to insert the keyframe, but I'm also going to do it for the rotation because we're actually rotating our camera as well. So those values are changing as well. Again, in the timeline view, I can now see a keyframe here. And if I was to expand that little panel over here, I can now see this is now on the keyframe object transforms X location and the rotation property. Again, let's just collapse that away. Don't really need to see that for now. Let's come to maybe frame 100 as well. And let's rotate our camera around to maybe here. Do make sure that you still have the camera selected in the outliner, and you should see all of these orange highlights indicating the values that have changed. Again, press I with the cursor over location and over rotation to create new keyframes for that. And if you now rewind and play this back, you can see that the camera now swings around the pirate treasure chest. Let's not forget to press N again to bring up the properties panel and unlock the camera from the view. If you now rotate your camera and break out of that, you can see there's the camera there. If you rewind and play this back, you can see that's the camera moving. So we've now animated the location and rotation of the camera. Awesome. Let's add some more. Now, as this plays back, it'd be really cool if the chest kind of just dropped down from the top. It kind of just dropped into the scene right in the middle of this camera move and then just ended up right in the middle. So let's select the base of the treasure chest, G and Z, and move it. The treasure chest and the lid are two separate objects, and you can animate them completely separate in any way you want, but it would be really nice if the lid was moving along with anything we did to the base. So right now you can move the base independently, and you can move the lid independently. One cool thing in Blender that you can use, and we haven't really talked too much about that, is parenting. You can link one object to another. So as the parent moves around or gets scaled and rotated, that also gets applied to the child. So they're kind of joined together. And it's super easy to do. Make sure you have nothing selected. First, select the lid, hold down Shift, then select the base of the treasure chest. By the way, let's come into the outliner as well and expand the chest collection. You can see right now there are two separate objects, one for the lid and one for the treasure chest itself. Make sure that the treasure chest is the one highlighted in the brighter color because that is your primary selection and that's what's going to become the parent of all of the other objects you have selected. So with this particular setup and the cursor over the 3D view, press Ctrl or Command and P to bring up the parent object. And in here, you now have a number of different options, but I'm simply going to select Set Parent to Object. So I'm just going to parent these objects together. And in the outliner, you may have noticed that my lid has disappeared. But I can now expand the treasure chest, and under the treasure chest, I now have the lid. So the lid is now a child of the treasure chest. And the great thing with this setup is now that I can grab the treasure chest, press G, and as I move it, the lid moves around. The even cooler thing is that I can grab the lid individually, press G, and move that independently of the base. However, if I now, again, select the base, the parent, press G, and move that, the lid stays in its relative position to that base because they're linked together. Let's undo that with Ctrl or Command and Z until we're back to where we started, but make sure the lid is still a child of the treasure chest. And let's add some animation. Let's come back to frame 1. Let's jump into camera view by pressing 0 on the numpad. Press G and Z. Let's move this treasure chest out of the view to the top, just a little bit above, so maybe to about there. In the properties panel with the treasure chest selected, press I over the location property to insert that keyframe. Let's come forward and you can see the camera animates, the light animates. So maybe around about frame 60 or so is when I want this treasure chest to be on the bottom. So G and Z, let's move the treasure chest back down and you can see the lid follows along. Let's place this right on the ground there. Again, over on the right hand side, press I to insert that keyframe. Again, you can just enable auto keying if you don't want to worry too much about it. It creates a few additional keyframes that you may not need, but that's not the end of the world either. So now, if you rewind and play this back. Cool, the treasure chest drops down from the top and into the shot, but it looks like it's being beamed down by a UFO. It looks really unnatural. So with all our keyframes still selected, let's simply right click, Interpolation mode, and change that over to bounce. Again, rewind and play this back. Cool, that actually looks really nice. Now I might adjust the timing a little bit, so let's click into our timeline to unselect everything, click and drag around the initial ones. I'm going to drag these over to maybe frame 30 or so, so the box won't start dropping until maybe around about frame 20. 30 is a bit late, so there the box drops right in, and then it comes to rest. Let's rewind and play this back. Cool, that looks really nice. Finally, let's add a little bit of an animation of the lid opening at the end to kind of reveal whatever is inside your treasure chest. So let's select the lid, press R and rotate that, maybe press X and rotate that. This doesn't quite work. Let's just break out of camera view and have a look at that. So every object in Blender rotates and scales around its origin, and the origin is represented by this little orange dot here. Shift and right click anywhere to move that 3D cursor out of the way. You can see that the little orange dot is in the center of the lid. If you press / on your numpad or come into view, local view, toggle local view to just show the lid itself. Maybe we'll go back to material preview as well so you can see that. You can see that the origin of the lid is right in the middle, and therefore any rotation you do, any scaling you do happens around this origin. However, you can actually change the position of this origin for every object. Let's just press Ctrl or Command and Z a couple of times to make sure we reset our lid. I'm going to press / on my numpad again to go back into local view so I can see what I am doing. And now I want to move the origin alone. Now there are quite a number of different options, and I can tell that right now Blender has a bit of a bug, and you can see my tools are overlapping my main header here, and I've noticed this in version 2.9 and in version 3.0, and there's actually quite an easy fix for that. You can simply come into Edit, Preferences, let me bring this in Interface, make sure you disable region overlap. And the moment I do that, you'll see my options and everything else come back here. I do not know why this is happening. It's a bug in Blender. It's been reported, so hopefully they'll get to fix that soon. Now, with my object selected, if I press G and move, I'm moving the entire object. However, if you pop open these options, there's an option here to say Transform Effects Origins Only, and you can tick that in here. And now if you press G, you're actually only moving that origin point. And that's exactly what we want. Now, if you don't have this enabled, you're moving the entire object. And this option is actually available in another spot as well. You can also press N to bring up the Properties panel. And under Tool, the options are also in here. So if you don't have this options drop down for whatever reason and you don't want to go through the interface fix, you also have that exact same option down in here in the Properties panel if you wanted to. So let's press 3 on your numpad to come into side view. Let's press G to move that origin point. Let's move it over to the right hand side, just onto that hinge point right there. Actually, let's press 7 to go into top view as well. Yeah, GX, and let's make sure that's centered right on the treasure chest, right where you would expect the hinge to sit. So that looks pretty good. Come into options, disable effects only origins. And if you now press R and X, you can now rotate the lid around that hinge because again, it always rotates around that origin point. Cool. Let's exit local view by pressing / on the numpad. And again, if you don't have a numpad, you can come into view, local view, toggle local view back out. Make sure that that origin point is at the back side of your treasure chest. If you moved it to the other side accidentally, you can always, again, just enable, move the origin and move it around in there. And you don't need to be in local view for that. So even if I now enable effects only origin, G and Y, I can now move the origin point for that treasure chest around freely. But let's undo that with Control or Command and Z. I'm happy where it is. Options, make sure you have effects only origins disabled. And let's actually just go back into render view because it just looks a bit nicer like that in Eevee. So now we're in a position where we can animate this lid to open up. So let's come back. Maybe let's go into camera view again with 0 on the numpad to maybe round about frame 60, maybe 65. With the lid selected, come over to the right hand side, press I over the rotation to insert a keyframe. Let's come to maybe frame 110, R, X, and let's open up that lid as far as we want to, maybe to round about there. Again, I to create a new keyframe, and by default this will be a Bezier interpolation, so it'll open slowly, and then it slows down towards the end, which looks nice. Let's rewind and play this back. One more time without anything selected. Cool, that looks really nice. Now, before we get to exporting this video, I'm noticing that the treasure chest is a little bit high up in the frame, especially once the lid is open. So let's reselect our camera. I'm just going to fix that last keyframe. Make sure you are on the last keyframe right here. You're not next to it, you're on that keyframe, and the properties are indicated as orange. Let's press N, come to view, and again lock the camera to view because I want to modify the position and rotation of the camera for this particular frame right here. And I'm just going to kind of rotate up a little bit and maybe down, just so that we can make sure that the entire treasure chest is in view, maybe around about there. Again, don't forget to press I with the cursor over those properties to insert new keyframes and update them. Again, you can also just right-click and select Replace Keyframe because there's an existing one already and Blender recognizes that, but just make sure that this is all back to yellow so it's baked in with the new position. So now, if you rewind, let's unlock the camera again. Recommend you don't forget that. Press N to hide that properties panel again, and let's play our animation back again. Yeah, that looks much better. But again, feel free to animate and add anything to the scene that you want. Finally, let's talk about how to export this animation into an actual video file that you can then upload to the internet, share with family or friends, or have criticized by random strangers on the internet. Now, one thing I always like to do, especially if you have some fast animations like a chest dropping down here, come into the render properties, and in Eevee, or whether you're using cycles, enable motion blur. It just adds a little bit of that motion blur to any moving objects, makes them look a little bit more organic. But now let's come to the output properties, and at the top here you can define the resolution. So right now it's set to 1080p, which is 1920 by 1080. You also have a drop down of presets here for 4K or different, NTSC versus PAL or whatever you want to. It's going to leave all of that as per normal. You also have your frame start and end time in here. These ones just replicate what you see in the timeline. So as you adjust these values, you'll see them here as well. So maybe let's export to, I'm actually okay. Let's leave this at 150. You can adjust your frame rate as well, but I like to use 24 frames per second, which is most common used for movies. Then a little bit further down, you'll find the output settings. Right now, it would write to my C drive on a temp folder. And again, you can just pop this open and browse a file location where you want to save your file into. So let's just jump into the tutorial folder here. Let's go into render, and maybe let's call this treasure chest. You don't need to add a file extension at all. That's going to happen when we export the video anyway. Let's hit accept. So that's now our output path. We want to add file extensions. And now we want to change the file format from a PNG, unless you want to export this as a PNG image sequence. Let's just pop this open. And the one you most likely want is FFmpeg video, which is the most standard way. Now, I do recommend pop open the encoding options down here. And I recommend set your video codec to H.264 unless you have some special requirements. It's the most common one for high definition video. It gives you good compression so the files won't get too big and it retains pretty good quality. You can also tweak the output quality here. You can either go lossless or say, low quality, medium, or maybe let's go high quality. It's just, a couple of seconds of video, and you can tweak some additional advanced parameters here if you want to, again, play with the quality of that output video. And with all of that set up, in order to render the file, come into Render and select to render animation. Blender is now going to render all of these frames out and package them into a single video file. And then on your hard drive, you should find a file. This one's called treasure chest 001 to 0150 because that was my frame rate.mkv. It's about 2 megabytes in size, which isn't too bad. And if you double click that, here's the final animation that we created and exported from Blender. Now, if you don't like that this is an MKV file, in Blender itself, in the output settings, you can change the container from Matroska, which gives you the MK4 file, to MP4 or a QuickTime MOV file or an AVI or any other format that you want. So feel free to play with this if you don't like the MKV format. I hope that this tutorial gave you a good start into how to create, modify, and work with animations in Blender, and how to then export that into video files that you can then share with the rest of the world. And that's all there is to it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you would like to see more. All and any useful links you will find in the video description, and please leave any comments, questions or suggestions down below. And with that, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.